We must continue today on our part 5 of our discussion on interpersonal communication, specifically nonverbal communication, or the world beyond words. If verbal communication is just that, the language we are using, including the words, nonverbal communication is everything else, everything that isn't words. Note that that's also going to consider things like volume, pitch, rate, utterances, guttural utterances that comes out of our voice, with our voice, but not specific words. Okay, so nonverbal communication includes not only gestures and body language, but also how we utter. So inflection, pauses, tone, volume, accent. These nonverbal features affect the meanings of our words. Nonverbal communication also includes features of our environment that affect interaction. It might include personal objects such as jewelry, clothing, physical appearance, and of course facial expressions. Depending upon the research and how the research study was done, and how the nonverbal versus the verbal communication is specifically measured, nonverbal behaviors account for 65 to 93% of the total meaning of communication. We pay attention to nonverbal communication more. I mean, the lesson here, 65 to 93%. How do I know what percentage specifically? Based on the specific context of those studies. I think the general rule of thought process that we want to get a hold of here is that we pay attention to nonverbal communication much more so than we pay attention to verbal communication in Western society. So what are the differences and similarities between verbal and nonverbal communication? Nonverbal communication is symbolic, just like verbal communication. Which means the characteristics of symbolism also apply. And those three characteristics are that communication, nonverbal communication, is arbitrary. Communication is arbitrary. Nonverbal communication is arbitrary. So for example, if I see somebody over there and I go up and give them a kiss on the cheek, that means something totally different depending upon who it might be and who's watching. Right? And it also might mean something totally different depending upon what culture I'm in. And if kissing on the cheek, for example, is the same as a handshake, depending on the culture. There are hand movements that we have attributed various meanings to, right? In the United States, the middle finger means something very specific. Not only does the middle finger mean something very specific, in other countries, two fingers means something very similar. And then there are other symbols, of course, as well. The thumbs up, for instance. The A-OK sign, for instance. The fist. And there are various other illustrations of nonverbal communication where we've attributed meaning. None of this is actually, this is the exact meaning as it is, etc. Meaning happens to lie within people and not within words. And in the case of nonverbal communication, we might say meaning lies within people and not within the action that we're paying attention to. Depending upon the context and the people involved, for example, a wink might express a romantic interest, might signal that I'm telling a joke and that I'm trying to be funny. Or it might be something as indicative as that person has something wrong with their eye and they get something caught in their eye and they're trying to blink it out. Nonverbal communication can be intentional or it can be unintentional, right? I can specifically be trying to give you that evil eye, that mean look, and try and give you the impression I'm angry with you. Or I might, for example, be cold And so I'm crossing my arms while I'm sitting in the chair, watching a presentation or listening to you speak, and you might interpret it as non-interest, as defensive, as something other than, I'm cold. And although the intention might not have been to express any of those things other than to try and keep warm, I unintentionally may have communicated, I'm not interested in this topic whatsoever. Why am I here? Nonverbal communication is rule-guided. It's rule-guided. And we learn these rules in our culture the same way that any other culture and any other person learns the rules of language, of verbal communication. Think about this for a minute. As I'm growing up, I quickly learn when mom or dad or whoever my primary guardian might be is talking, you don't interrupt, especially if they're scolding you for something. I quickly learn when I can speak, what topics I might speak about, but it might be the simple fact, something as simple as when I ask you a question, I'm inviting you to speak because I'm looking at you. I get silent, I'm looking at you, and by the mere fact that I asked the question, I got silent, and I'm looking, I'm expecting you, and you understand that I'm expecting you to respond. It's rule. These are rules that we learn within the culture. And of course, then nonverbal communication reflects our culture. Students, for example, in Asia, the first time I ever taught a class in Asia, I honestly thought that students were being very rude to me. Why? Because every one of them sat in the room, silent, and looking down at their paper, and refused to look up at me. In the West, especially in America, we grow up with the look at me when I'm talking to you attitude. Because what does it mean that I'm paying attention? It means my eyes are focused. And I'm watching you. And while you're talking, I'm paying attention. In Asia, just the reverse is true. If I'm going to get up and look at you, I'm challenging you. I'm being disrespectful. And if you don't know that going in, it was quite confusing to me. I went on with my lecture. I talked about what I needed to talk about. But I left thinking, has anybody paid any attention to me whatsoever? Did they even understand English? Because the fact was, nobody even looked at me the entire time. Could I have been invisible? And yet, it was a cultural thing where they were showing respect the entire time. In the United States, in a classroom, for instance, it is considered normal to ask questions and perhaps challenge the thinking of the instructor and the topics that the instructor is presenting. In Asia, you never do so. So when I'd ask, for example, does anybody have any questions? The question itself was almost culturally inappropriate because nobody would have asked a question during the class if for any other reason then I might not have a good answer. If I didn't have a good answer, I could lose face, consecutively lose respect, appear not to be the expert, and they would look defiant. Not going to happen. Not in a typical Chinese classroom, a typical Asian classroom, typical Korean classroom, Japanese classroom, etc. So nonverbal communication also reflects our culture. Nonverbal communication tends to be perceived as more believable, 65 to 93% based on the various contexts of various studies suggest so. But even just think of this in terms of, especially if you're going into nursing or if you know a nurse, you go into the hospital, or even if you're home and you know somebody who's ill. You walk in and see them, hello, Mr. Smith, how are you doing today? And Mr. Smith gives you that look of, I'm just fine. Can I go home now? Now, what are you going to believe? The words or the facial expression and the tense body, etc., that might indicate either that Mr. Smith probably isn't just fine. Probably wants to go home, but there's something else wrong. And we're going to believe actions, behavior, nonverbal communication far more quickly than we will believe verbal communication. The danger with that, however, is that there is no universal dictionary for nonverbal communication. And because of that, verbal communication can be quite subjective. And when it's that subjective, although I believe it more, I don't know always what I'm supposed to believe specifically. Nonverbal communication is multi-channel, whereas verbal communication, when we talk about verbal communication, it's a single channel, it's the words. Multi-channel, I've got the voice, I've got the inflection, I've got the facial expression, I've got the smell, I've got the look, I've got the whatever your senses are perceiving at the time. And nonverbal communication is continuous. Nonverbal communication is continuous. You cannot not communicate with respect to nonverbal communication. If you are part of the context, even, for example, if you are part of the fact that you are here, you signed up to be here today, and you didn't show, your absence is communicating something because we are aware of your absence. So when people say, I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything, I'm not communicating anything, that's actually untrue. Intentional or unintentional, you cannot not communicate. Nonverbal communication is continuous. Nonverbal communication often establishes relationship-level meanings. Relationship-level meanings. It's going to we're talking about things like responsiveness. If you look my way, I immediately meet your eyes. I look your way with a smile on my face because I'm trying to be responsive because we are suggesting we have a close relationship. What if I want to suggest that we don't have a close relationship? You may look my way and I'm giving you that puzzle look like, what? What? What'd I do? What are you talking about? What are you trying to indicate to me? I can add emphasis through volume. So although the words I might say when you come in, I might say sit down. Can I emphasize that? I sure can. By increasing the volume, you come in, I say, sit down! Do you think I'm adding urgency to it? It becomes much more important because I added volume. I can repeat messages, can't I? I can simultaneously say yes while nodding my head. And from an arbitrary standpoint in the West, especially in the United States, the nodding of the head like this means yes. So when I say yes and I'm nodding the head, I'm emphasizing by repeating it. You're getting it from more than one channel. Nonverbal communication can also regulate interaction. Eye gaze patterns. Eye gaze patterns. We invite others to speak by looking at them. We talked about this. What about normal conversation? Now think about this for a moment. How does that pattern go? You all know it. You just haven't you may not have paid attention to it. If you're having a conversation with somebody face to face with one other person, for example, you're looking directly at them for a couple of moments and then you're looking away and you're looking away while you have the floor, while you're speaking, while you're talking. What are you doing if you're listening? If you're listening, I'm looking probably right at you because I'm focused and paying attention. And it is the customary norm in the United States that if I am looking at you, it means I'm paying attention. We talked about this. But if I'm going to stare at you while I'm talking the entire time, and I keep staring at you without actually moving my eyes back and forth, it somehow gets a little creepy, doesn't it? Because that person's, now we're thinking that person's just looking a little bit too much. And so what do? I look at you while I'm having a conversation. I might look this way, I might look that way, I might look this way, and I'll come back and meet your eyes. Why? Because I'm also checking that you're still paying attention. And then I'll make the rounds again. But when I'm ready to turn over the conversation to you, whether I want you to answer a question or to contribute at this time or to indicate that I'm finished, you can talk now, I'll finish and I'll look at you again. I've asked a question or I'm indicating it's your turn, and I'll look at you, I'll fall silent. And when you start speaking, I'll probably continue looking at you, but you'll start the pattern. And that's very typical. That's very typical. And one of the things when we start talking about research and how do you tell if somebody isn't being completely truthful to you? And as a side note, I'm not going to go into this today at length, but as a side note, in some of the research on the physiological measures of the detection of deception, one of the areas that we often discuss is the idea of the micro-momentary facial expression, which happens about 1/3 of a second, lasts about 1/3 of a second, after someone has heard some information and reacts to it genuinely for the first time. After the first time, they're going to give you whatever facial expression that they've deemed that they want to give you, and they can control that. But what happens as far as, have you ever had somebody, usually a relative, I can always tell when they're not quite telling me the truth. I can always seem to guess when they're not quite telling me the truth. Now, some people might call that being psychic, having great intuition. You know what my guess is? My guess is that you're not following the standard, culturally learned eye gaze pattern. If I ask you a question that indicates there's something amiss, that you might feel compelled to not tell me the truth, when you first hear that information, there's the likelihood that first 1/3 of a second when you receive that information, you're going to react, and then you're going to give me the facial expression you want to give me. But if in this eye gaze pattern, I ask you a question, as soon as you start speaking, maybe I've looked another way in order to give you the opportunity to take the floor, and then I look back. I've chosen not to pay attention to what you might give me during that 1/3 of a second after receiving the question. My guess is if you've got somebody that you specifically think, oh, you know what, I always seem to tell when they're not telling me the truth about something. My guess is you've been actually looking at their face the whole time and you caught something that was inconsistent of a flash across their face during their response. You may not have been able to tell, oh, wait a minute, that was something kind of out of the ordinary. But at that point, it triggered your intuition to suggest something's not quite right. Something's not quite right. So we also have regulation, interaction. We regulate interaction through nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication can also show whether or not we like somebody, can't it? I can give you a smile. I can give you a frown. I can shake your hand, give you a hug. I can pat you on the back or punch you in the nose. I can certainly indicate to you in many ways without saying any words whether or not I like you or if I don't. And to the degree of whether or not I like you or I don't. We also use nonverbal behaviors to assert dominance and power, to negotiate for status and influence. Given what we know about genders, in the West, and many other countries as well, other parts of the world, males have a tendency to exert dominance. non-verbally as well as verbally. So who's more likely to touch the other? Man to a woman or a woman to a man? More likely man to a woman. Who's more likely to touch the other? A superior to a subordinate or a subordinate to a superior? The superior to the subordinate. And in fact, that whole idea of touch, we're going to talk about that later, which is often considered a very power and dominance issue, happens all the time. Someone pulled over by the police with the idea that they might be arrested is not going to lay a hand on the policeman. A patient isn't expected to ever touch a doctor. And students hardly ever touch a teacher. But the reverse happens. If you're getting arrested and put in cuffs, for instance, you're going to be touched by the police person. If the doctor is trying to examine you and determine whether or not you've got a particular illness, the doctor is going to touch you during that examination. Oftentimes in grammar and primary schools, teachers will walk around as students are doing the work and might lay an encouraging hand on a shoulder to offer support and encouragement to the student who's either doing a good job or needs that encouragement to continue doing some excellent work. Nonverbal communication reflects and expresses cultural values. We know this. And the amount of touch shows that. Some cultures are much more willing to hug and to touch than other cultures. Subcultures, co-cultures throughout the United States do the same thing. There are some places around our own country, for example, where people are more willing to touch others, even in the family or etc., whether it's a pat on the back, a handshake, a punch in the arm, hugs, or whatever. Some parts of the culture are much more willing than others. So what are the types of nonverbal communication? First one we'll talk about is kinesics. Kinesics. Kinesics refers to body position and body motions, including those of the face. Kinesics. Body position and body motions. How are you sitting during a job interview? If you're sitting like this, what are your chances of getting the job? What is this expressing? Essentially, I'm not all that interested. Or, I don't really care about this particular institution, or I don't care about the person in front of me. Facial expressions. Are you smiling? Are you looking like you want to be somewhere? Or are you looking like you're in pain to be here at all? How you sit, how you stand. You know, I always laugh because we talk about sometimes going to parties. When I go to a party and I go in, one of the things that I often find interesting is that, are people actually standing like this, or are they standing like this? I'm not interested necessarily in a conversation, or I'm interested in interaction. Very open movements, very closed movements, often telling about one's attitude. Do I have my back to others when I'm having a conversation with somebody at a party? Essentially saying what? This is sort of a closed conversation, and we're really not open to having somebody else come in and interrupt us. Or saying what? This is an open conversation, and if anyone else comes up, we're happy to have that person join us. Do we do this consciously or unconsciously? The answer is yes. Sometimes we do both consciously and or unconsciously. Kinesics. Body movement, body posture. How we're standing says something. How we're moving says something. How we walk says something. And people evaluate and form opinions as a result. Haptics. Haptics have to do with touch. The sense of touch and what it means. The sense of touch. You know, human beings actually require touch to be fully engaged human beings. We live in a society where we have to get along with other human beings. They've done, for example, a study years back where they divided the nursery at a hospital into two sections, and the babies in one section of the nursery were given all the attention they could possibly get. And the nurses and those who cared for the babies came in and held the babies, and they gave them all kinds of attention and touched them and dealt with the babies as far as the changing and the feeding, etc., etc., etc. Then the other group of babies, they changed and they fed and they gave the basic requirements too. But they didn't give all the extra touching and playing with, etc. And they saw a significant difference in the growth, the physical growth and attitudes of the two sets of babies. Those that were touched and got extra attention certainly had a more significant growth. Kinesics, movement. Haptics, touch. Physical appearance, third. Physical appearance. What does physical appearance say about anything? Well, according to Western cultures, it says everything. And maybe it shouldn't. But we place an awful lot of importance on physical appearance. Face-to-face interactions, most of us notice how the other person looks. We often base our initial evaluations of someone on how they look. What is their body shape? What does their hygiene look like? What kind of clothes are they wearing? What shoes are they wearing? In a business scenario, are those shoes polished? And does it matter? Well, it does to a lot. We look at a lot of things in that respect. And the emphasis in our Western culture on physical appearance has actually led to things like eating disorders and the quest to be thin, cosmetic surgery and the quest to stay looking young, and lots of money spent on beauty and hair care products, makeup, cosmetics, salons to do hair in certain ways, etc. That industry, as you well know, huge, huge. Physical appearance. Will we hire somebody if we're looking for somebody for a job? If the only difference between the two candidates were their physical appearance? Yeah, we will. Western culture, we will, because we have certain expectations of physical appearance, of the image we want our company to have. And we're going to look for somebody who we often use in terms of cultural fit. What does cultural fit mean? It can mean a whole lot of things, but oftentimes it means, do you fit the appearance of the person we want? Kinesics, haptics, physical appearance, artifacts. Artifacts. Artifacts are personal objects that we use to announce our identity and personalize our environment. It might be as something as the choice of glasses frames that we use. Jewelry, whether it's earrings, necklace, nose ring, or other piercings. It might be something as interesting as tattoos. Artifacts. What are we carrying? What are we wearing that says something about us? You know, for example, I'm almost always carrying something I created. Almost always carrying something I created. Why? Because it also gives me something to discuss and talk about if somebody says, you know, what do you do? Well, and oftentimes we define ourselves by our occupation, but do we need to? Can we define ourselves by what we do outside of our occupational time? We could. You know, and so people often ask me, what do you do with all your free time once they find out I don't own a TV? so I don't spend the hours that lots of other people may spend in front of the television. All right, kinesics, haptics, physical appearance, artifacts, environmental factors. Number 5, environmental factors. These are elements of things like the HVAC system. Are you working in a location that's way too warm, or visiting a location that's way too cold? What does it say to you about wanting to be there? What does it communicate to you about the organization's attitude toward your comfort? Do you know that the furniture in most fast food restaurants is hard and impersonal on purpose? The lights in a fast food restaurant are bright on purpose. They want you to go in there, not get too comfortable, and they want to turn the table over so that they can keep people coming in and going out, because they anticipate that the food, for example, at most fast food restaurants are considered to be somewhat low in cost. Now, whether or not you agree with that will depend on your relative stance in this economy. However, if the food is low in cost, how are they going to make money? By turning people over. Sell things to them and keep them moving. People won't often stay if they hope to stay inside the restaurant and eat if all the tables are full. The hard seats are not made for lounging. The bright lights are not made for relaxing, lengthy conversations. And yet, you'll notice more fine dining restaurants. The lights are a little bit more ambient and dim. The furniture is a lot more comfortable, and it's more conducive to relaxing and sitting for longer periods of time. But you'll also notice what? The price of the meals you pay for that luxury, don't you? The price of the meals are usually higher. Did you know that there are certain colors that are supposed to calm people down? And certain colors that are supposed to get people excited? And they've been testing this theory in prisons, for example, by making the walls of various prisons around the country that have been looking at some of this testing, Pepto-Bismol pink, light blue, because these colors are supposed to be more calming. So environmental factors. You might also look, for example, at the way an office is set up. When I look at an office, I'm going to look at, the next one on my list, proxemics. Proxemics and personal space. First off, we have ways of trying to keep our own personal space, right? In the West, we often stand away from each other. But when I go to Asia, for instance, I often take a backpack with me, a day pack, much like lots of people here use for school. Even if I put nothing in it. Why? Because for some cultures, they don't have the same personal space requirements that I have grown up in the West with, and I feel most comfortable having a little bit of personal space around me. Other people do not need that in other cultures because they were not necessarily raised with that requirement internally. So when I get on a bus or I get in a line, and I'm in a culture where people don't require that, sometimes it feels really strange to have somebody breathing down your neck. And when we talk about personal space, for instance, there are some cultures that actually suggest that you cannot have a conversation, a meaningful conversation with me, unless you can feel the breath upon which the words were spoken. How close do you need to be to feel the breath of the words that were spoken? Now, being this close to someone usually makes them very uncomfortable, if you're from the West. So why do I take a backpack with me? So I can stand like this? What am I doing? I'm making sure I'm taking the space that I want, right? The backpack's up here, so it's kind of pushing people a little bit farther back, just because if they're going to get that close, they can get that close to the backpack. Give me a little bit what I'm going to call breathing room, right? When we talk about personal space, it's always interesting sometimes to have somebody from the Far East or the Middle East who require that kind of space, that space is more comfortable than someone from the West who maybe that space is much more comfortable. Now, if you want the exact numbers of space and what's good and what the rings are, etc., look in your text, because that's going to be where you'll find that mostly. But in general, it's interesting just to note that different cultures have different different requirements for personal space. And as such, I have on occasion done the experiment where I have put two people, one from alternative cultures, up here, and asked them to read a script to each other to the rest of the class. I've asked the rest of the class to watch what was going on and make observations. And what has often happened is the person who requires less space and feels they need to be closer to the person they're having an interaction with will usually take a step closer and usually enter into that personal space requirement of the person from the more Western area, Western culture, who will then take a step back. And this will continue. And the rest of the class gets an interesting show often, because what happens is one of them will either corner the other one, to the point that the one from the West will wind up being in the corner and actually doing something like this while they're reading, and maybe not even realize they did it. Or they wind up doing laps around the room. Personal space, our requirements are different from culture to culture, but we do indeed have those requirements. And who do we let into our personal space? In the West, the closer we let people into our personal space, the more intimate of a relationship we have with them. So usually family or significant others. Proxemics, we're talking about the way we use space, and it might be, for example, the way we arrange space. How do I arrange an office in the United States? Usually if I go in, I have a desk, and I have two chairs, and the one chair for the professional on the other side of the desk. What does that desk say? There's a barrier here, isn't there? There's a barrier here. It's very different, and it says very different things than when you go into the office where the desk might be up against the wall, and then the chair might be there, and there's two chairs. So now it looks like there's this open space between three chairs. The two chairs for the client or clients, and the one chair for the professional. A very different circumstance here. And it communicates something very different between whether or not there should be a distance between us, or whether or not I don't see the distance, we're on the same team working together. Now, there are many offices where the actual professional doesn't have a choice. The furniture is already designed and put in there for them. But then it was an organizational choice, consciously or unconsciously. And then the final type of, next one, proxemics, personal space, kinesics, haptics, physical appearance, artifacts, environmental factors, proxemics, personal space, chronemics. Chronemics. How do I use time? How do I use time? I used to work for a Fortune 500 company, one of my first career moves after my bachelor's degree many years ago, and I worked in sales. I had a manager who used to call a 9 o'clock meeting very regularly during the week. Do you know what time that manager used to start that meeting every time they called a 9 o'clock meeting? 8:45. They'd say 9. They'd start at 8:45 as a rule of what they would do, as their own organizational culture, non-stated rule. And if you were later than 8:45, you were marked late. Why? Because this organization was trying to train us to think minimally we need to be 15 minutes early for everything we do. Minimally we need to be 15 minutes. And and earlier is okay. And because we were salespeople, and we didn't always work on appointments, the theory was if you kept being 15 minutes early, eventually you're going to run into somebody else who you might be able to talk to, who might be in the office or close by, and get another sales call in, yay. Or if you were early and they were ready for you early, you could get that one done and add something else at the end of the day. But in terms of time proficiency, what does it say? At what point in this culture do you owe somebody an apology for being late? 10 minutes? 15 minutes? 30 minutes? From culture to culture to culture, that changes. When I was working, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the dean who was Saudi and also a power thing in many cases would say, I need a meeting with your staff at 10 o'clock. That dean might not have shown up till 1 o'clock, but we were expected to wait for him. Now, as a Westerner, that can be very infuriating, right? Because you're thinking, what disrespect for time. But in terms of chronemics, this is just standard operating procedure in certain parts of the world. And yet, in the Western culture, we even put our calendars together in a very monochromatic time. I do this, I finish this, this ends, I start this. And I have a very specific pattern, this very specific order of things. In a polychronic culture, I might schedule a whole bunch of things and get to them as I can. Paralanguage being the other one. We've already alluded to this one already. Okay, after chronemics, how about paralanguage? Paralanguage is everything that comes out of our voices and our throats and our mouths, except the words themselves. Pitch, rate, volume, utterances. If I ask you, hey, how are you doing today? And you just look at me and go, am I going to find in the dictionary? No. But do I have a pretty good understanding of what it means? I do. It means I'm probably not doing all that well. Can I spell? I'm not entirely sure. But you get the idea. Paralanguage, everything that comes out of our mouths, including pauses between. Now, here's one of the things we often talk about with respect to pauses. Inflection is paralanguage. Pauses is paralanguage. Let's go back, for example, now to a comment that, again, I'm not going to go into the psychophysiological measures of the detection of deception at length in this lecture. We're just doing a general presentation on nonverbal communication. However, pauses are very interesting to note. And research has been done on this to suggest that pauses can be very significant in a conversation you have in an interview. But this varies from culture to culture. And when I teach interview workshops, we go over this. And I think it's important to know now. If I ask you a question, and let's say you're in a job interview. If I ask you a question, and you immediately rattle off your answer, research shows us that more often than not, the interviewer is going to think, what? Memorized, rehearsed. They practiced that one, so how serious might I take that particular answer? Well, it depends on whether or not you believe memorized answers are acceptable to what you're trying to get at. Now, I ask you a question in an interview, you thoughtfully pause for a moment. Even if, we work on training this in interview workshops. Even if it is memorized, you thoughtfully pause for a moment as if you're giving the question its due consideration that it deserves because it was asked. And if that person asked the question, they deserve the respect of a thoughtful response, right? We'll go with that for the moment because you want the job.
So even if you rehearse, make sure you pause.
Yes. So even if you rehearsed it and you know what it is, pause. Give it a thoughtful moment, then answer the question, even if you knew exactly what you were going to respond to. But here's the kicker, culture to culture to culture. If you pause just a fraction of a second too long, you go from thoughtful consideration, I'm glad you gave my question thoughtful consideration, to this is taking too long. anything that comes out of your mouth now, I'm going to assume is being completely made up. It's a delicate balance. Silence, paralanguage pauses in paralanguage can be very, very important. Let's talk about silence, the last one. So I've got kinesics, haptics, physical appearance, artifacts, environmental factors, proxemics and personal space, chronemics, paralanguage, silence being the last one. Silence. What is it communicating? Not always what you hope it will. If your significant other talks too much, in your opinion, and all of a sudden they've decided they're going to get angry with you and give you the silent treatment, they might be intentionally trying to express, I'm angry with you, you need to recognize that I'm angry with you, and so I'm not talking to you. Because it's possible that, that you might actually interpret it completely the opposite. Thank God that person finally shut up. I have some peace. It's possible. And yet, silence can be awkward. Silence can be awkward. Silence can be comfortable if people are comfortable with each other. Awkward if people feel that there's something that needs to be said, but I can't think of anything. It can be really awkward, for example, for students or people at a job interview, if the question is asked and the person's looking directly at you and you got nothing. You got nothing. You have no idea what you want to say. Nothing's coming to you, and the teacher or the interviewer is looking at you, and because they're looking at you, you're starting to feel the pressure. And this is where what? Seconds feel like hours. Because you don't know where to go with it, what to do with it. So, silence can speak volumes while not saying anything, right? Depending upon how we interpret it and potentially on the intention of the person being silent. Or it can express thoughtful consideration. You know, looking at all of these, I will tell you, a number of years back when I was attached to the University of Iowa, a news station in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids, asked me to come up and give, and to the 10 o'clock news, and asked me to give an analysis of the body language of an interview that was being given by Saddam Hussein. This was before the United States invaded the country. And during that time, they asked if I'd come up. He was going to be interviewed by Tony Benn, a British diplomat, on one of the popular news magazine television shows. And the local news wanted to get my opinion of interpretations of his body language during that interview. Okay. When they called me, I said, I don't think it's a good idea. They said, why? I said, because when we start talking about trying to interpret body language, we really kind of need to know some sort of baseline. Saddam Hussein hadn't given an interview to a Western diplomat in over 10 years previously. So there was nothing for me to look at and say, oh, okay, I can see a pattern forming here that when he does this, he's kind of alluding to this. When he does this, he's kind of indicating this. When he does this, etc., etc. I said, we don't have any. So the best that I can tell you at any given point in his interview is, generally speaking, it might indicate this. However, I would be loath to actually draw that conclusion because there is no baseline of historical evidence to suggest that his behavior specifically, etc., etc. And as a consequence, anything that I would say would be entirely inconclusive. They said, we'd really like you to come anyway. I said, great. If you want me to come after I've already said that the majority of my answers, I can already tell you what they're going to be, and that they're going to be some sort of phrasing of, it's rather inconclusive. Because we don't have a baseline of behavior to which to compare it to. They sit great. And so during that time, the question finally, he'd say something, Tony Benn would ask him a question, he'd respond. Every so often the microphones would come into my face and they'd ask me, well, what do you think about this? I'd pretty much start going through the line, well, it's relatively inconclusive because we don't have a baseline of behavior, etc., etc. Finally, the big question was asked. Where, as I recall, Tony Benn said something to the effect of, Saddam Hussein, do you have weapons of mass destruction hidden in your country? See, at this point, we didn't even know what Saddam Hussein's grasp of the English language was. So he asked it in English, while the Iraqi Arabic interpreter was rephrasing the question. Saddam Hussein had some sort of grimace come across his face. Immediately, the microphones were put in my face. What does that mean? What does that mean? I was getting pretty tired of saying, this is rather inconclusive, we've got no basis from which to draw it on, so I immediately said, it could essentially mean that he had bad fish for lunch. And that he was suffering from indigestion. Remember this? Am I supposed to immediately interpret that because you might be doing this in my classroom, that you are putting up the walls of defense, that you're no longer interested in what I have to say? Or could I easily also assume that it's cold in here? Could I also assume that he had a bad piece of fish for lunch and that he was suffering from indigestion, and at that time he was suffering a cramp and it showed on his face? I could! But media being what it is, you have to at least appreciate the fact that they wanted a story, they got a story. And so when it hit the 10 o'clock news, bad fish for lunch was now reinterpreted as, and when asked whether or not he was holding weapons of mass destruction hidden in his country by Tony Benn, Dr. Searcy indicated that there was no evidence offered to the opposite. That from bad fish for lunch. We've got to be careful about how we interpret nonverbal communication. And because there is no universal dictionary, they can be interpreted in many different ways. And sometimes we will be dead wrong. And sometimes people will use vague interpretations to what they want to have it interpreted as. We call that spin in verbal communication, right? And I will tell you, when it comes to the whole idea of nonverbal communication in the courtroom, one of the areas that I'm published in, one of the interesting things to note is I have been asked by various attorneys to come in and sit in on trials. We'd like you to come in and sit in on a trial, and we'd like you to tell me when you think this person may or may not be lying. Again, research in the psychophysiological measures of the detection of deception. That's a very difficult thing to do in a trial. Because what is a trial? In the United States, it is in essence a play, a rehearsed play that is being performed for an audience of 6 to 12, or depending upon the jurisdiction, how many people are in the jury box. Have you practiced everything that you possibly could practice before even getting to trial? Yes. Micro-momentary facial expressions really are only effective the first time somebody gets some information. Have they, in a trial, is this the first time they're going to hear this information? Oh, I'm sure not. Now, to be able to look at some of these things and say, I can see it in the deposition, or I can see it in the initial criminal interrogation, that's a different story. Because this is perhaps the first time they've been officially asked that question, and the information may be new to them, and it might shock them. And even in the age of videotape, at 30 frames per second, we're able to catch some of these micro-momentary facial expressions as they may occur, and you can slow them down, and stop them, and look at them, and study them. When we talk about, and I want to make a word about lie detector tests, because that's a really bad thing to even talk about as far as I'm concerned, because Maury Povich, for example, has actually done the world a disservice by suggesting that in the name of ratings, that particular test is, so infallible. We asked you this, and the lie detector determined that was a lie. As if this were the most infallible statement that could be made, and I wonder how many relationships he has ruined in the name of ratings. Polygraph is the proper name for a lie detector. A polygraph means essentially that it's multiple measurement. And just because somebody says something and it's outside expected, again, just like the expected behavior, I don't have record of it from Saddam Hussein. It's very difficult to pin somebody down specifically on a polygraph to suggest that they're lying. Really. They're going to tell you again and again that they want to and that they think they can and that they have. Because why? Polygraphs are not admissible in court for that very reason. But if they tell you they gotcha, they're really hoping that you'll, at that point, confess. If there was something to confess. But think about this for a moment. If asked the question, did you rape that person, Mr. Smith? Maybe Mr. Smith didn't rape anybody, but he's being suspected of it. And maybe, because the question was asked, his emotions and his blood pressure and everything else just went skyrocketed. Maybe he's got an emotional trigger to that particular word because he had a relative who was. There are problems that need to be addressed with the polygraph. And the media frenzy surrounding lie detector is infallible. I'm just going to caution you and say, not quite true. What I am going to suggest when we talk about the psychophysiological measures of the detection of deception is that there is nothing that is infallible. But when people ask me to go and look at these kinds of things, I'm looking for hot spots. In other words, something that is inconsistent, that may not exactly be on the up and up. When somebody asks me, hey, what's going on? I point out areas that might be hot spots that require more research to delve into. And that's important there. All right, so how do we improve our nonverbal communication issues? Number one, we monitor our nonverbal communication, much like we can monitor our verbal communication. I can monitor, because through self-reflection, as I'm doing things, what are the reactions I'm getting from people as I'm doing them? And if it's not the reactions, if it's violently different than what I expect, then maybe I need to look at how I'm acting and ask some questions for clarification. Number two, interpret others' nonverbal communication tentatively. Don't pretend you can interpret things exactly. It's not possible. Again, I'm going to go right back to this. Are you putting up defenses or are you cold? If I'm going to interpret that you're putting up defenses without acknowledging that you might be cold, I'm causing a misunderstanding that between us from the very get-go that you didn't intend. And it happens, I think, far too often in society today. So, with respect to understanding the context of any situation, be very careful to monitor and interpret nonverbal communication that happens between people, that happens in your life, tentatively. Seek questions, seek answers, ask questions for clarification if you need to.